Chapter 11. In the country, he led just as nervous and restless a life as in town. He read and wrote a great deal. He studied Italian, and when he was out for a walk, thought with pleasure that he would soon sit down to work again. He slept so little that everyone wondered at him. If he accidentally dozed for half an hour in the daytime, he would lie awake all night, and after a sleepless night would feel cheerful and vigorous as though nothing had happened. He talked a great deal, drank wine, and smoked expensive cigars. Very often, almost every day, young ladies of neighboring families would come to the Posadzkis and would sing and play the piano with Tanya. On late times, a young neighbor who was a good violinist would come too. Kavern listened with eagerness to the music and singing, and was exhausted by it. And this showed itself by his eyes closing and his head falling to one side. One day, he was sitting on the balcony after evening tea, reading. At the same time, in the drawing room, Tanya, taking soprano, one of the young ladies a contralto, and the young man with his violin were practicing a well-known serenade of Braga's. Kavern listened to the words. They were Russian and could not understand their meaning. At last, leaving his book and listening attentively, he understood. A maiden, good full of sick fancies, heard one night in her garden, and mysterious sounds, so strange and lovely that she was obliged to recognize them as a holy harmony, which is unintelligible to us mortals, and so flies back to heaven. Kavern's eyes began to close. He got up and in exhaustion walked up and down the drawing room and then the dining room. When the singing was over, he took Tanya's arm and with her went out on the balcony. "I have been all day thinking of a legend," he said. "I don't remember whether I have read it somewhere or heard it, but it is a strange and almost grotesque legend. To begin with, it is somewhat obscure. 1,000 years ago, a monk, dressed in black, wandered about the desert, somewhere in Syria or Arabia. Some miles from where he was, some fishermen saw another black monk who was moving slowly over the surface of a lake. The second monk was a mirage. Now forget all the laws of optics, which the legend does not recognize, and listen to the rest. From that mirage, there was cast another mirage, and from that, other a third. So that the image of the black monk began to be repeated endlessly from one layer of the atmosphere to another. So that he was seen at one time in Africa, at another in Spain, then in Italy, then in the far north. Then he passed out of the atmosphere of the earth. And now he is wandering all over the universe, still never coming into conditions in which he might disappear. Possibly he may be seen now in Mars, or in some star of the Southern Cross. But my dear, the real point on which the whole legend hangs lies in the fact that exactly 1,000 years from the day when the monk walked in the desert, the mirage will return to the atmosphere of the earth again and will appear to men. And it seems that the 1,000 years is almost up. According to the legend, we may look out for the black monk today or tomorrow. A queer mirage, said Tanya, who did not like the legend. But the most wonderful part of it all, laughed Covering, is that I simply cannot recall where I got this legend from. Have I read it somewhere? Have I heard it? Or perhaps I dreamed of the black monk. I swear I don't remember. But the legend interests me. I have been thinking about it all day. Letting Tanya go back to her visitors, he went out of the house and, lost in meditation, walked by the flower beds. The sun was already setting. The flowers, having just been watered, gave forth a damp, irritating fragrance. Indoors they began singing again, and in the distance, the violin had the effect of a human voice. Covering, racking his brains to remember where he had read or heard the legend, turned slowly towards the park and unconsciously went as far as the river. By a little path that ran along the steep bank between the bare roots, he went down to the water, disturbed the peewits there, and frightened 2 ducks. The last rays of the setting sun still threw light here and there on the gloomy pines, but it was quite dark on the surface of the river. Covering crossed to the other side by the narrow bridge. Before him lay a wide field, covered with young rye, not yet in blossom. There was no living habitation, no living soul in the distance. And it seemed as though the little path, if one went along it, would take one to the unknown, mysterious place where the sun had just gone down, where the evening glow was flaming in immensity, in splendor. How open, how free, how still it is here, thought Covering, walking along the path. And it feels as though all the world were watching me, hiding and waiting for me to understand it. But then waves began running across the rye, and the light evening breeze softly touched his uncovered head. A minute later there was another gust of wind, but stronger. The rye began rustling, and he heard behind him the hollow murmur of the pines. According, Hovren stood still in amazement. From the horizon there rose up to the sky, like a whirlwind or a waterspout, a tall black column. Its outline was indistinct, but from the first instant it could be seen that it was not standing still, but moving with fearful rapidity, moving straight towards Kofin. And the nearer it came, the smaller and the more distinct it was. Covering moved aside into the rye to make way for it, and only just had time to do so. A monk, dressed in black, with a gray head and black eyebrows, His arms crossed over his breast, floated by him, as their feet did not touch the earth. After he had floated 20 feet beyond him, he looked round at Kovrin and nodded to him with a friendly but sly smile. But what a pale, fearfully pale, thin face! Beginning to grow larger again, he flew across the river, collided noiselessly with the claybank and pines, and passing through them, vanished like smoke. "Why, you see," muttered Kovrin, "there must be truth in the legend." Without trying to explain to himself the strange apparition, glad that he had succeeded in seeing so near and so distinctly not only the monk's black garments, but even his face and eyes, agreeably excited, he went back to the house. In the park and in the garden, people were moving about quietly. In the house, they were playing, so he alone had seen the monk. He had an intense desire to tell Tanya and Yegor Semyonich, but he reflected that they would certainly think his words the ravings of delirium, and that would frighten them. He had better say nothing. He laughed aloud, sang, and danced the mazurka. He was in high spirits, and all of them, the visitors and Tanya, thought he had a peculiar look, radiant and inspired, and that he was very interesting. Chapter 12. After supper, when the visitors had gone, he went to his room and lay down on the sofa. He wanted to think about the monk. But a minute later, Tanya came in. "Here, Andriusha, read Father's articles," she said, giving him a bundle of pamphlets and proofs. "They are splendid articles. He writes capitally." "Capitally, indeed," said Yegor Semyonich, following her and smiling constrainedly. He was ashamed. "Don't listen to her, please. Don't read them. Though, if you want to go to sleep, read them by all means. They are a fine soporific." "I think they are splendid articles," said Tanya, with deep conviction. "You read them, Andriusha, and persuade Father to write oftener. He could write a complete manual of horticulture." Yegor Semyonich gave a forced laugh, blushed, and began uttering the phrases usually made use of by an embarrassed author. At last he began to give way. "In that case, begin with Gaucher's article, and these Russian articles," he muttered, turning over the pamphlets with a trembling hand. "Or else you won't understand. Before you read my objections, you must know what I am objecting to. But it's all nonsense. Tiresome stuff. Besides, I believe it's bedtime." Tanya went away. Yegor Semyonich sat down on the sofa by Kovrin and heaved a deep sigh. "Yes, my boy." And he began, after a pause, "That's how it is, my dear lecturer. Here, I write articles and take part in exhibitions and receive medals. Posadzki, they say, has apples the size of a head. And Posadzki, they say, has made his fortune with his garden. In short, Kochubey is rich and glorious. Certain, but one asks oneself, what is it all for? The garden is certainly fine, a model. It's not really a garden, but a regular institution, which is of the greatest public importance, because it marks, so to say, a new era in Russian agriculture and Russian industry. But what's it for? What's the object of it? The fact speaks for itself. I do not mean in that sense. I meant to ask what will happen to the garden when I die. In the condition in which you see it now, it would not be maintained for 1 month without me. The whole secret of success lies not in its being a big garden or a great number of laborers being employed in it, but in the fact that I love the work. Do you understand? I love it, perhaps more than myself. Look at me. I do everything myself. I work from morning to night. I do all the grafting myself, the pruning myself, the planting myself. I do it all myself. When anyone helps me, I am jealous and irritable till I am rude. The whole secret lies in loving it, that is, in the sharp eye of the master. Yes, and in the master's hands, and in the feeling that makes one. When one goes anywhere for an hour's visit, sit, fill at ease, with one's heart far away, afraid that something may have happened in the garden. But when I die, who will look after it? Who will work? The gardener? The laborers? Yes. But I will tell you, my dear fellow, the worst enemy in the garden is not a hare, not a cockchafer, and not the frost, but any outside person. And Tanya? Asked Cavern, laughing. She can be more harmful than a hare. She loves the work and understands it. Yes, she loves it and understands it. If after my death, the garden goes to her, and she is the mistress, of course nothing better could be wished. But if, which God forbid, she should marry, Yegor Seminich whispered, and looked with a frightened look at Kovrin. That's just it. If she marries and children come, she will have no time to think about the garden. What I fear most is she will marry some fine gentleman. And he will be greedy, and he will let the garden to people who will run it for profit. And everything will go to the devil the very first year. In our work, females are the spooge of God. Yegor Semenich sighed and paused for a while. Perhaps it is egoism, but I tell you frankly, I don't want Tanya to get married. I am afraid of it. There is one young dandy comes to see us, bringing his violin and scraping on it. I know Tanya will not marry him, I know it quite well, but I can't bear to see him. Altogether, my boy, I am very queer. I know that. Yegorseminich got up and walked about the room in excitement, and it was evident that he wanted to say something very important, but could not bring himself to it. I am very fond of you, and so I am going to speak to you openly, he decided at last, thrusting his hands into his pockets. I deal plainly with certain delicate questions and say exactly what I think, and I cannot endure so-called hidden thoughts. I will speak plainly. You are the only man to whom I should not be afraid to marry my daughter. You are a clever man with a good heart and would not let my beloved work go to ruin. And the chief reason is that I love you as a son, and I am proud of you. If Tanya and you could get up a romance somehow, then, well, I should be very glad and even happy. I tell you this plainly, without mincing matters, like an honest man. Kavrin laughed. Yegorseminich opened the door to go out and stood in the doorway. If Tanya and you had a son, I would make a horticulturist of him, he said, after a moment's thought. However, this is idle dreaming. Good night. Left alone, Kavrin settled himself more comfortably on the sofa and took up the articles. The title of one was on, intercropping of another. A few words on the remarks of Messire Z concerning the trenching of the soil for a new garden. A third additional matter concerning grafting, with a dormant bud. And they were all of the same sort. But what a restless, jerky tone. What nervous, almost hysterical passion. Here was an article, one would have thought, with most peaceable and impersonal contents. The subject of it was the Russian Antonovsky apple. But Yegorseminich began it with Audiatores altera pars and finished it with Sapienta sat. And between these two quotations, a perfect torrent of venomous phrases directed at the learned ignorance of our recognized horticultural authorities, who observe nature from the height of their university chairs, or at Monsieur Gaucher, whose success has been the work of the vulgar and the dilettanti. And then followed an inappropriate, affected, and insincere regret that peasants who stole fruit and broke the branches could not nowadays be flogged. It's beautiful, charming, healthy work, but even in this, there's strife and passion. Not Kavrin. I suppose that everywhere and in all careers men of ideas are nervous, and marked by exaggerated sensitiveness. Most likely it must be so. He thought of Tanya, who was so pleased with Yegorseminich's articles. Small, pale, and so thin that her shoulder blades stuck out, her eyes wide and open, dark and intelligent, having intent gaze, as though looking for something. She walked like her father with a little hurried step. She talked a great deal and was fond of arguing, accompanying every phrase, however insignificant, with expressive mimicry and gesticulation. No doubt she was nervous in the extreme. Coverin went on reading the articles, but he understood nothing of them and flung them aside. The same pleasant excitement with which you had earlier in the evening danced in the Zerka and listened to the music was now mastering him again and rousing a multitude of thoughts. He got up and began walking about the room, thinking about the black monk. It occurred to him that if this strange supernatural monk had appeared to him only, that meant that he was ill and had reached the point of having hallucinations. This reflection frightened him, but not for long. But I am all right, and I am doing no harm to anyone. So there is no harm in my hallucinations, he thought. And he felt happy. Again, he sat down on the sofa and crossed his hands round his head, restraining the unaccountable joy which filled his whole being. He then paced up and down again and sat down to his work. But the thought that he read in the book did not satisfy him. He wanted something gigantic, unfathomable, stupendous. Towards morning, he undressed and reluctantly went to bed. He ought to sleep. When he heard the footsteps of Yegor Semyonich going out into the garden, Kovarin rang the bell and asked the footman to bring him some wine. He drank several glasses of Lafitte, then wrapped himself up, head and all. His consciousness grew clouded, and he fell asleep. Chapter 13. Yegor Semyonich and Tanya often quarreled and said nasty things to each other. They quarreled about something that morning. Tanya burst out crying and went to her room. She would not come down to dinner nor to tea. At first, Yegor Semyonich went about looking sulky and dignified, as though to give everyone to understand that for him, the claims of justice and good order were more important than anything else in the world. But he could not keep it up for long, and soon sank into depression. He walked about the park dejectedly, continually sighing. Oh my God, my God. And at dinner, did not eat a morsel. At last, guilty and conscience-stricken, he knocked at the locked door and called timidly. Tanya, Tanya. And from behind the door came a faint voice, weak with crying, but still determined. Leave me alone, if you please. The depression of the master and mistress was reflected in the whole household, even in the laborers working in the garden. Kovarin was absorbed in his interesting work. But at last he, too, felt dreary and uncomfortable. To dissipate the general ill humor in some way, he made up his mind to intervene. And towards evening he knocked at Tanya's door. He was admitted. Fee, fee, for shame. He began playfully, looking with surprise at Tanya's tear-stained, woebegone face, flushed in patches with crying. Is it really so serious? Fie, fie. But if you knew how he tortures me, she said, and floods of scalding tears streamed from her big eyes. He torments me to death, she went on, wringing her hands. I said nothing to him. Nothing. I only said that there was no need to keep too many laborers. If we could hire them by the day when we wanted them. You know the laborers have been doing nothing for a whole week. I only said that. And he was shouted, and I said a lot of horrible, insulting things to me. What for? There, said Cobran, smoothing her hair. You've quarreled with each other. You've cried, and that's enough. You must not be angry for long. That's all the more, as he loves you, beyond everything. He has spoiled my whole life. Tanya went on, sobbing. I hear nothing but abuse and insults. He thinks I am of no use in the house. Well, he is right. I shall go away tomorrow. I shall become a telegraph clerk. I don't care. Come. You mustn't cry, Tanya. You mustn't, dear. You are both hot-tempered and irritable, and you are both to blame. Come along. I will reconcile you. Cavern talked affectionately and persuasively, while she went on crying, twitching her shoulders and wringing her hands, as though some terrible misfortune had really befallen her. He felt all the sorrier for her because her grief was not a serious one, yet she suffered extremely. What trivialities were enough to make this little creature miserable for a whole day, perhaps for her whole life? Comforting Tanya, Hovren thought that, apart from this girl and her father, he might hunt the world over and would not find people who would love him as one of themselves, as one of their kindred. If it had not been for those two, he might very likely, having lost his father and mother in early childhood, never to the day of his death have known what was meant by genuine affection and that naive, uncritical love, which is only lavished on very close blood relations. And he felt that the nerves of this weeping, shaking girl responded to his half-sick, overstrained nerves like iron to a magnet. He never could have loved a healthy, strong, rosy-cheeked woman. Pale, weak, unhappy, Tanya attracted him. And he liked stroking her hair and her shoulders, pressing her hand and wiping away her tears. At last, she left off crying. She went on for a long time, complaining of her father and her hard, insufferable life in that house, entreating Covren to put himself in her place. Then she began, little by little, smiling and sighing that God had given her such a bad temper. At last, laughing aloud, she called herself a fool and ran out of the room. When a little later, Covren went into the garden, Yegor Sunyanij and Tanya were walking side by side along an avenue as though nothing had happened. And both were eating rye bread, with salt on it, as both were hungry. Chapter 14. Glad that he had been so successful in the part of peacemaker, Kovrin went into the park, sitting on a garden seat, thinking. He heard the rattle of a carriage and a feminine laugh. Visitors were arriving. When the shades of evening began falling on the garden, the sounds of the violin and singing voices reached him indistinctly, and that reminded him of the black monk. Where, in what land or on what planet was that optical absurdity moving now? Hardly had he recalled the legend and pictured in his imagination the dark apparition he had seen in the rye field, when, from behind a pine tree exactly opposite, there came out noiselessly, without the slightest rustle, a man of medium height, with uncovered gray head, all in black, and barefooted like a beggar. And his black eyebrows stood out conspicuously on his pale, death-like face. Nodding his head graciously, this beggar or pilgrim came noiselessly to the seat and sat down. And Kovrin recognized him as the black monk. For a minute, they looked at one another, Kovrin with amazement, and the monk with friendliness, and, just as before, a little slyness, as though he were thinking something to himself. "But you are a mirage," said Kovrin. "Why are you here and sitting still? That does not fit in with the legend." "That does not matter." The monk answered in a low voice, not immediately turning his face towards him. "The legend, the mirage, and I are all the products of your excited imagination. I am the phantom. Then you don't exist," said Kovrin. "You can think as you like," said the monk, with a faint smile. "I exist in your imagination, and your imagination is part of nature. So I exist in nature. You have a very old, wise, and extremely expressive face, as though you really had lived more than 1,000 years, said Kovrin. "I didn't know that my imagination was capable of creating such phenomena. But why do you look at me with such enthusiasm? Do you like me? Yes, you are one of those few who are justly called the chosen of God. You do the service of eternal truth. Your thoughts, your designs, the marvelous studies you were engaged in, and all your life bear the divine, the heavenly stamp, seeing that they are consecrated to the rational and the beautiful that is, to what is eternal. You said eternal truth, but is eternal truth of use to man, and within his reach if there is no eternal life? There is eternal life, said the monk. Do you believe in the immortality of man? Yes, of course. A grand, brilliant future is in store for you men. And the more there are like you on earth, the sooner will this future be realized. Without you, who serve the higher principle and live in full understanding and freedom, mankind would be of little account. Developing in a natural way, it would have to wait a long time for the end of its earthly history. You will lead it some thousands of years earlier into the kingdom of eternal truth, and therein lies your supreme service. You are the incarnation of the blessing of God, which rests upon men. And what is the object of eternal life? Asked Kavrin. As of all, life enjoyment. True enjoyment lies in knowledge, and eternal life provides innumerable and inexhaustible sources of knowledge, and in that sense, it has been said, "In my Father's house there are many mansions." If only you knew how pleasant it is to hear you. And they said, Kavring, rubbing his hands with satisfaction, "I am very glad. But I know that when you go away, I shall be worried by the question of your reality. You are a phantom, an hallucination. So I am mentally deranged, not normal. What if you are? Why trouble yourself? You are ill because you've overworked and exhausted yourself. And that means that you've sacrificed your health to the idea. And the time is near at hand when you will give up life itself to it. What could be better? That is the goal towards which all divinely endowed, noble natures strive. If I know I am mentally affected, can I trust myself? And are you sure that the men of genius, whom all men trust, did not see phantoms too? The learned say now that genius is allied to madness. My friend, healthy and normal people are only the common herd. Reflections upon the neurasthenia of the age, nervous exhaustion and degeneracy, etc., can only seriously agitate those who place the object of life in the present that is the common herd. The Romans used to say, mens sana in corpore sano. Not everything the Greeks and the Romans said is true. Exaltation, enthusiasm, ecstasy, all that distinguishes prophets, poets, martyrs for the idea from the common folk is repellent to the animal side of man, that is his physical health. I repeat, if you want to be healthy and normal, go to the common herd. Strange that you repeat what often comes into my mind, said Kovrin. It is as though you had seen and overheard my secret thoughts. But don't let us talk about me. What do you mean by eternal truth? The monk did not answer. Kovrin looked at him and could not distinguish his face. His features grew blurred and misty. Then the monk's head and arms disappeared. His body seemed merged into the seat in the evening twilight, and he vanished altogether. The hallucination is over, said Kovrin. And he laughed. It's a pity. He went back to the house, light-hearted and happy. The little the monk had said to him had flattered, not his vanity, but his whole soul, his whole being. To be one of the chosen, to serve eternal truth, to stand in the ranks of those who could make mankind worthy of the kingdom of God some thousands of years sooner, that is. To free men from some thousands of years of unnecessary struggle, sin, and suffering to sacrifice to the idea, everything youth, strength, Health to be ready to die for the common weal. What an exalted, what a happy lad. He recalled his past pure, chaste, laborious. He remembered what he had learned himself and what he had taught to others, and decided that there was no exaggeration in the monk's words. Tanya came to meet him in the park. She was by now wearing a different dress. "Are you here?" she said. "And we have been looking and looking for you. But what is the matter with you?" she asked in wonder, glancing at his radiant, ecstatic face and eyes full of tears. "How strange you are, Andriusha." "I am pleased, Tanya," said Kavrin, laying his hand on her shoulders. "I am more than pleased. I am happy." "Tanya, darling Tanya, you are an extraordinary nice creature. Dear Tanya, I am so glad. I am so glad. I am so glad." He kissed both her hands ardently and went on. "I have just passed through an exalted, wonderful, unearthly moment. But I can't tell you all about it, or you would call me mad and not believe me. Let's talk about it. Dear, delightful Tanya, I love you and am used to loving you, to have you near me, to meet you a dozen times a day has become a necessity of my existence. I don't know how I shall get on without you when I go back home." "Oh," laughed Tanya, "you will forget about us in 2 days. We are humble people, and you are a great man. Now, let us talk in earnest." He said, "I shall take you with me, Tanya." "Bess, will you come with me?" "Will you be mine?" "Come," said Tanya, and tried to laugh again. But the laugh would not come, and patches of color came into her face. She began breathing quickly and walked very quickly, but not to the house, but further into the park. "I was not thinking of it. I was not thinking of it," she said, wringing her hands in despair. And Kavrin followed her and went on talking, with the same radiant, enthusiastic face. "I want a love that will dominate me altogether. And that love only you, Tanya, can give me. I am happy, unhappy." She was overwhelmed and huddling and shrinking together, seemed 10 years older all at once. Well, he thought her beautiful and expressed his rapture aloud. "How lovely she is." Chapter 15. Learning from Kavrin that not only a romance had been got up, but that there would even be a wedding. Yegor Semyonich spent a long time in pacing from one corner of the room to the other, trying to conceal his agitation. His hands began trembling, his neck swelled, turned purple, and he ordered his racing droshky and drove off somewhere. Tanya, seeing how he lashed the horse, and seeing how he pulled his cap over his ears, understood what he was feeling, shut herself up in her room and cried the whole day. In the hothouses, the peaches and plums were already ripe. The packing and sending off of these tender and fragile goods to Moscow took a great deal of care, work, and trouble. Owing to the fact that the summer was very hot and dry, it was necessary to water every tree, and a great deal of time and labor was spent on doing it. Numbers of caterpillars made their appearance, which, to Kovrin's disgust, the laborers and even Yegor Semyonich and Tanya squashed with their fingers. In spite of all that, they had already to book autumn orders for fruit and trees and to carry on a great deal of correspondence. And at the very busiest time, when no one seemed to have a free moment, the work of the fields carried off more than half their laborers from the garden. Yegor Semyonich, sunburnt, exhausted, ill-humored, galloped from the fields to the garden and back again, cried that he was being torn to pieces and that he should put a bullet through his brains. Then came the fuss and worry of the trousseau, to which the Posovskis attached a good deal of importance. Everyone's head was in a whirl from the snipping of the scissors, the rattle of the sewing machine, the smell of hot irons, and the caprices of the dressmaker, a huffy and nervous lady. And as ill luck would have it, visitors came every day, who had to be entertained, fed, and even put up for the night. But all this hard labor passed unnoticed, as though in a fog. Tanya felt that love and happiness had taken her unawares, though she had, since she was 14, for some reason been convinced that Kovrin would marry her and no one else. She was bewildered, could not grasp it, could not believe herself. At 1 minute, such joy would swoop down upon her that she longed to fly away to the clouds and there pray to God. At another moment, she would remember that in August she would have to part from her home and leave her father. Goodness knows why. The idea would occur to her that she was worthless, insignificant, and unworthy of a great man like Kovrin. And she would go to her room, lock herself in, and cry bitterly for several hours. When there were visitors, she would suddenly fancy that Kovrin looked extraordinarily handsome, and that all the women were in love with him and envying her. And her soul was filled with pride and rapture as though she had vanquished the whole world. But he had only to smile politely at any young lady for her to be trembling with jealousy, to retreat to her room, and tears again. These new sensations mastered her completely. She helped her father mechanically, without noticing peaches, caterpillars, or laborers, or how rapidly the time was passing. It was almost the same with Yegor Semyonich. He worked from morning till night, was always in a hurry, was irritable, and flew into rages. But all of this was in a sort of spellbound dream. It seemed as though there were two men in him. One was the real Yegor Semyonich, who was moved to indignation and clutched his head in despair when he heard of some irregularity from Ivan Karlovich the gardener. and another not the real one, who seemed as though he were half drunk. Would interrupt a business conversation at half a word, touch the gardener on the shoulder, and begin muttering, "Say what you like. There is a great deal in blood." His mother was a wonderful woman, most high-minded and intelligent. It was a pleasure to look at her good, candid, pure face. It was like the face of an angel. She drew splendidly, wrote verses, spoke 5 foreign languages, sang. Poor thing. She died of consumption. The kingdom of heaven be hers. The unreal Jaeger Semyonich sighed, and after a pause went on. When he was a boy and growing up in my house, he had the same angelic face, good and candid. The way he looks and talks and moves is as soft and elegant as his mother's. And his intellect. We were always struck with his intelligence. To be sure, it's not for nothing. He's a master of arts. It's not for nothing. And wait a bit. Ivan Karlovich, what will he be in 10 years' time? He will be far above us. But at this point, the real Yegor Semyonich, suddenly coming to himself, would make a terrible face, would clutch his head and cry, "The devils! They have spoiled everything. They have ruined everything. They have spoilt everything. The garden's done for. The garden's ruined." Havrin, meanwhile, worked with the same ardor as before, and did not notice the general commotion. Love only added fuel to the flames. After every talk with Tanya, he went to his room, happy and triumphant, took up his book or his manuscript with the same passion with which he had just kissed Tanya, and told her of his love. What the black monk had told him of the chosen of God, of eternal truth, of the brilliant future of mankind, and so on, gave peculiar and extraordinary significance to his work, and filled his soul with pride and the consciousness of his own exalted consequence. Once or twice a week, in the park or in the house, he met the black monk and had long conversations with him. But this did not alarm him, but on the contrary, delighted him, as he was now firmly persuaded that such apparitions only visited the elect few, who rise up above their fellows and devote themselves to the service of the idea. One day, the monk appeared at dinner time and sat in the dining room window. Havrin was delighted and very adroitly began a conversation with Jaeger Semyonich and Tanya of what might be of interest to the monk. The black-robed visitor listened and nodded his head graciously. And Yegor Semyonich and Tanya listened too, and smiled daily without suspecting that Kavrin was not talking to them, but to his hallucination. Imperceptibly, the fast of the Assumption was approaching, and soon after came the wedding, which at Yegor Semyonich's urgent desire was celebrated with a flourish that is, with senseless festivities that lasted for 2 whole days and nights. 3,000 rubles worth of food and drink was consumed. But the music of the wretched hired band, the noisy toasts, the scurrying to and fro of the footmen, the uproar and crowding, prevented them from appreciating the taste of the expensive wines and wonderful delicacies ordered from market. Chapter 16. One long winter night, Coverin was lying in bed, reading a French novel. Poor Tanya, who had headaches in the evenings from living in town, to which she was not accustomed, had been asleep a long while, and from time to time articulated some incoherent phrase in her restless dreams. It struck 3 o'clock. Hovering put out the light and lay down to sleep. Lay for a long time with his eyes closed, but could not get to sleep because, as he fancied, the room was very hot. And Tanya talked in her sleep. At 4:30, he lighted the candle again, and this time he saw the black monk sitting in an armchair near the bed. "Good morning," said the monk, and after a brief pause he asked, "What are you thinking of now?" "Of fame," answered Coverin. "In the French novel I have just been reading, there is a description of a young savant who does silly things and pines away through worrying about fame. I can't understand such anxiety. Because you are wise. Your attitude towards fame is one of indifference, as towards a toy which no longer interests you. Yes, that is true. Renown does not allure you now. What is there flattering, amusing, or edifying in their carving your name on a tombstone, then time rubbing off the inscription together with the gilding? Moreover, happily, there are too many of you for the weak memory of mankind to be able to retain your names." "Of course," assented Coverin. "Besides, why should they be remembered? But let us talk of something else. Of happiness, for instance. What is happiness?" When the clock struck 5, he was sitting on the bed, dangling his feet to the carpet, talking to the monk. In ancient times, a happy man grew at last frightened of his happiness. It was so great. And to propitiate the gods he brought, as a sacrifice, his favorite ring. Do you know, I, too, like Polycrates, begin to be uneasy of my happiness. It seems strange to me, but from morning to night, I feel nothing but joy. It fills my whole being and smothers all other feelings. I don't know what sadness, grief, or boredom is. Here I am, not asleep. I suffer from sleeplessness, but I am not dull. Here, I say it in earnest. I begin to feel perplexed. But why? The monk asked in wonder. Is joy a supernatural feeling? Ought it not to be the normal state of man? The more highly a man is developed on the intellectual and moral side, the more independent he is, the more pleasure life gives him. Socrates, Diogenes, and Marcus Aurelius were joyful, not sorrowful. And the apostle tells us, Rejoice continually, rejoice and be glad. But will the gods be suddenly wrathful? Hovren jested, and he laughed. If they take from me comfort and make me go cold and hungry, it won't be very much to my taste. Meanwhile, Tanya woke up and looked with amazement and horror at her husband. He was talking, addressing the armchair, laughing and gesticulating. His eyes were gleaming, and there was something strange in his laugh. Andreyusha, whom are you talking to? She asked, clutching the hand he stretched out to the monk. Andreyusha. Whom? Oh. Whom? Said Hovren in confusion. Why? To him. He is sitting here, he said, pointing to the black monk. There is no one here. No one. Andreyusha, you are ill. Tanya put her arm round her husband and held him tight, as though protecting him from the apparition, and put her hand over his eyes. You're ill, she sobbed, trembling all over. Forgive me, my precious, my dear one. But I have noticed for a long time that your mind is clouded in some way. You are mentally ill. Andrusha. Her trembling infected him too. He glanced once more at the armchair, which was now empty, felt a sudden weakness in his arms and legs, was frightened, and began dressing. It's nothing, Tanya. It's nothing, he muttered, shivering. I really am not quite well. It's time to admit that. I have noticed it for a long time, and Father has noticed it, she said, trying to suppress her sobs. You talk to yourself, smile somehow strangely, and can't sleep. Oh my God, save us, she said in terror. But don't be frightened. Andrusha, for God's sake, don't be frightened. She began dressing too. 17. Only now, looking at her, Hovren realized the danger of his position, realized the meaning of the black monk and his conversations with him. It was clear to him now that he was mad. Neither of them knew why they dressed and went into the dining room. She in front and he following her. There they found Yegor Semyonich standing in his dressing gown and with a candle in his hand. He was staying with them and had been awakened by Tanya's sobs. Don't be frightened, Andreyusha, Tanya was saying, shivering as though in a fever. Don't be frightened. Father, it will all pass over. It will all pass over. Hovren was too much agitated to speak. He wanted to say to his father-in-law in a playful tone, congratulate me. It appears I have gone out of my mind. But he could only move his lips and smile bitterly. At 9 o'clock in the morning, they put on his jacket and fur coat wrapped him up in a shawl, and took him in a carriage to a doctor.